Hi, Jonathan. Welcome to the All About Ibogaine podcast that we started literally a few weeks ago when Trump's executive order came through. And I realized that a lot of people would be looking for information about Ibogaine. And I also realized that there would be a lot of people who were kind of just getting into the Ibogaine game who would be advertising and putting themselves up as being experts. And so I wanted to create a forum for the real experts to speak to a broader audience. Um, so I'm really
Very
excited
cool.
about you.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for making the time because I'm sure you're very busy right now with the explosion of new interest in Ibogaine. Um, so before we get started talking about your book, um, Ibogaine and the Bicameral Mind, I would love to ask you to share a little bit about your origin story with Ibogaine itself, how you encountered it. Um,
Sure. Well, I mean, the origin story kind of goes back to I was in high school and got put on SSRI antidepressants. So it was I don't know, a pretty common type of situation, I would think,
I would
for
think for
somebody going through like high school. And it's just I was in a place where we went into the doctor and I was handed a 9-item questionnaire that had Zoloft written on the top. And when I filled it out, then they told me that I needed a Zoloft prescription. So I was on SSRIs and different ones because it didn't make me feel very good. So they thought, well, if that's the case, then it must be like a remission of your or sorry, return of your depression. So we'll try a different one because it's not working. And then that didn't help either. And I would not sleep. So they put me on another one, another. So I kept going. And eventually I just told them I don't want to take this anymore and then stopped. So I, I mean, it's not the best way to do it. I know now would have been to taper off of them. But even still, I don't think everybody has that severity of withdrawal. I just had really bad withdrawal coming off of them. Some of the literature I read says like 20, 25% maybe of people have bad withdrawal symptoms, but I was on the high end of that spectrum. I had very bad withdrawal and it lingered for years. So psychedelics for me, when they kind of came into my life, really helped me to come out of a very dark and weird psychological place. So I was pretty committed to them and
yeah.
to learning everything I could about them, and also didn't really care about them being approved because what had been offered to me that was approved was harmful to me. What had been offered to me by my friends, it's like gnarled little mushrooms, were actually really helpful. So I didn't really care about going through approved channels. But at the time, as I started to get involved in trying to find out where we could talk about psychedelics, it was around like other people who were talking about drugs. And in Canada at the time, that mostly centered around a bunch of really big news around the downtown east side of Vancouver and the rollout of like a supervised injection site called Insight that was very famous in putting out really interesting research. There was also a study called the Naomi trial, the North American Opioid Medication Initiative, I think. And they were basically just prescribing heroin to people and showing that people's lives stabilized after they were on. And so all of this was the conversation that was happening. So I sort of wandered into this, trying to bring up psychedelics every opportunity that I could. But eventually I learned a lot from it, and people started to point me towards Ibogaine, saying, you know, you're gonna see that it brings all these ideas together. And that's sort of what Ibogaine's been for me, is this like bringing all of these disparate lines of interest and things that are really important to me in like one space, which I'm sure it's the same for a lot of people who are close to it.
I think that's the Ibogaine effect of grounding you in purpose in a certain way that is just so remarkable. Just so, and you see it playing out in the lives of people who have taken Ibogaine and how they get drawn into it. And I've seen you, the last time I saw you was in San Diego, at some talk I was giving, and you came to it. And here we are, 10 years later or something, still really into it. So, yeah. Um, so, I I'm really dying to get into the subject of the bicameral mind. So, did you want to share something more? Did I interrupt you in in the completion of your story?
No, I mean that was the beginning that like put me on the path, and I ended up in Mexico working at clinics in like 2009. And then there's a whole other story, but that's sort of the origin story. What you asked about was why, like what brought me to it, which was different in a lot of ways than what brought a lot of other people who were around the community at that time.
Right.
But
Yes, your entry into it from SSRIs and psychedelics is really significant because a lot of people are on SSRIs and they're not necessarily in the addiction camp, or they might be, but not necessarily. And there's this whole mental health dimension to it that you came from, and so I find it to be very significant. You know, both where you came from and what you're saying in the book about the potential of ibogaine and the bicameral mind. And um, there were several things that jumped out at me in your book about the bicameral mind. And I've heard about this because I come from India. I'm Hindu,
mhm.
Hindu upbringing. I I've heard about this concept called Hamsa, and it's a swan, and it's the shape of a swan, and it's this bridge in your mind between the two sides of between your left and your right brain. And so I did let me just pull it up. I did a little search, and I asked about um, this. Let me just pull it up.
Would it be helpful if we mentioned a little bit about what the bicameral mind is? Because when I
Yes,
heard it,
yes.
it wasn't obvious to me what it was. I had to really like wrestle with the idea and to even understand what it was, let alone like why it would be maybe interesting with Ibogaine.
Yeah, I would love. Yeah, I would love to hear your
Or if
definition
we did
of
that first.
bicameral mind.
Hmm. So bicameral just means there's like two chambers. Um, and the bicameral mind what came out of a theory of a psychologist named Julian Jaynes, who was at Princeton and did work at other schools and stuff. But he developed a theory that consciousness was not always the same throughout history, and that we have a very different sort of experience of ourselves and of consciousness than people did in the past. And then he tried to describe what that might have been like. So he thought consciousness sort of emerged out of the breakdown of something called the bicameral mind, which was our ancient ancestors. He thought this particularly happened around 3,000 years ago. So like more ancient ancestors would sort of experience cognition and reason through like two chambers in the mind. And one would be just acting out repetitive or routine tasks, or how to kind of like traditional answers towards problems that they would come up against in the world. And then when there were situations that like tradition didn't have a great answer for, and it would create this kind of decision stress, that another answer would come from this other chamber of the mind that was maybe deeper and that we didn't identify directly with, um, sort of a more creative mechanism. And that in the process of transmitting from this one chamber to the other, it sort of passed through a filter that would turn it into something that we heard as language and often like a voice. And so it would appear or seem to people like they were listening to the voice of somebody. And so he says that explains or helps to explain potentially like the voice of God or of gods or of spirits or ancestors or anything else. So I thought that was really interesting as a starting point with Ibogaine because of just of how common it is that people describe sort of being really connected with their normal sense of cognition and then being sort of approached by something else and then often feeling like they're in dialogue with this other thing. But whereas like DMT can make you feel like you're blasting off and seeing aliens, often this other that we encounter in the Ibogaine experience can feel like it's very personal to us, like part of us, or it knows us very deeply. And so that sort of lends it this familiarity that we could associate with this bicameral theory. I think that it is sort of like a materialistic way of breaking it down, but I think it is useful for us to like, I don't know, sometimes people come out of IBM experiences and they're saying, it told me to do this or whatever. And sometimes it's useful to be able to reflect on like maybe they're just also still ideas that you have to work out. Like maybe it doesn't actually have a immediately have a divine origin. But then there's other evidence that comes through, obviously, that makes it seem like, okay, but maybe this part of ourselves is actually connected to either a collective unconscious or a divinity or something. And some information is just getting filtered through this experience of the sort of ancient ancestral voice that we hear. And so, anyways, I didn't want to stop at the materialistic framework, but I do think that it gives us a good sort of tool to, or like language to start talking about Ibogaine and some of its characteristics in a way. So that's what the bicameral mind is about.
I love that you opened the doorway to this conversation about the bicameral mind with your book and with some of the things you posed in there, because I think many of us who've gone through a lot of journeys have experienced this. I mean, I call it the reconciliation of opposites. That's a process happening inside of me while I'm going through a journey, and I was going to bring up this thing about you said about it has these profound spiritual roots. And as a Hindu, I heard about this thing called swan, and so it's called Hamsa. And so I asked here, what is the relationship between the bicameral mind and the Hindu swan symbolism? Um, and it says here that it's basically in the concepts describe a divided yet interconnected structure of consciousness and the ultimate transition into self-awareness, which is where both those two sides, which is literally reflected in the word individual, in divide dual, like this is how we are. We have these two parts, and we have it in male and female, or creative and receptive. In the I Ching, it goes like that, yin and yang, that these two parts come together in us and we make a whole out of it. So I wanted to ask you whether you have heard about this idea, and that's like the Julian Jaynes is talking about this 20th century psychological theory, and the Hamsa is an ancient spiritual metaphor, but they have this deep intersection because it's actually going on in us. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you to comment upon is a trefoil. In your book you talk about this symbol of the trefoil, the knot that is made of one thing but has three parts. And the way that I look at that is body, mind, and spirit, that it's all one but it's divided into these three. So I was wondering if you could comment on that point of view. um,
Yeah, well,
com-
no, I hadn't heard about the swan. I'd be really interested to learn more about it. But I think yeah, what I've seen is that as like James was really diving into like looking for evidence of the bicameral mind in like Western sources, so Western literature. So he was looking at like Homer and early literature and sort of describing that the way that people used to tell stories before used to be evidence of that. There's this bicameral mind that would sort of guide people's decision making under duress, right? So the examples being like when Achilles was storming Troy and he was dejected at one moment and like goes down to the water and he's upset. And so his mother Thetis, who's like the goddess of the river or whatever, comes out of the water and consoles him and gives him guidance and things like that. So that the stories are really heavily dependent on that. But what I've seen in general, and I don't know enough about, um, like I haven't read so deeply into the Indian texts a little bit, but what I've seen repeatedly is that when Westerners kind of discover something, there's often this very deep tradition of self-reflection and philosophy of that in Indian literature in
Right.
the past. So I'm not surprised in this case too. Yeah.
Right. So I think I brought it up because just to say that um, these themes arise in different philosophies and religions all over the world. They're spiritual themes, and Ibogaine holds the ability to be that bridge for people in such a powerful way that it can bring the spirituality into the conversation. For me, I feel like there is a marked lack of conversation about the spiritual dimension, and you brought it in with this bicameral mind idea, saying it's in your physiology to have that. And I think what this Hamsa thing is saying is it's in your physiology to bridge it too. you know, that we
Hmm.
as human beings. So I was wondering if I'm sure you've seen that in Ibogaine, but can you reflect on that? Um,
Yeah. Well, I think that's so James would have said that we had to abandon the bicameral mind as sort of consciousness evolved. But then you look at the history of religious spiritual practice, and basically it has correlates of the bicameral all through it. So it's almost like people were still trying to be able to access this other type of problem solving mechanism. So, he would say that there were examples of people who came out in more like in the modern conscious world with a bicameral mind and were really impressive to people. Like Socrates was talking about, like that he was in conversation with this daimonion that he would talk with and would sort of give him information. And so that sort of became the foundation of Western philosophy was this sort of dialectic back and forth exchange that like Socrates and that experience that he was having laid the foundation for. Or you look at like prophets who would come and have this kind of experience that would all of a sudden ripple through people's minds, become very impressive to them. And I think even if you look at like the simplest kind of spiritual practices that we have, a lot of them are about not only trying to alter consciousness, but trying to engage in some kind of dialogue with mantras or prayer. And it really is about trying to be in communication with something through language, right? And so I think that's also what people um how do you say, like people miss about the spiritual experience is this sense of being responded to, like the sense of like aloneness or whatever. I think so there's almost like a deep sense of a powerful sense of lack that we don't hear the voice back as often as we feel like we need to. Right. And so I think it still sort of shapes us and it's a part of us. And I think part of the reason why we like would go back to it or try to reignite it in certain moments is because consciousness is something really specific. And it's very good at solving certain types of problems, but it's not good at solving every type of problem that we run into. And that there was other types of situations that maybe the bicameral mind or maybe other sort of modes of cognition and reasoning were more apt at being able to solve. So,
yeah, like computing, for example, is a left brain activity,
mm,
right? And other things like mothering, you could say, is like more of a right brain activity. There are those natural divisions that you're talking about. Can you describe how Ibogaine, how this works, like what Ibogaine brings to this whole idea of the bicameral mind, both in its effects and in you described it in your book really well, but if you could either
I'll try. I
quote
don't know. It's
passages
easier
from
when
the
I have
book
time to
or
sit down. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah, like one of the things, so the way that, and I really leaned on Jane's just as a sort of almost like something to be in dialogue with, like to give some shape to a discussion. And so what he describes as consciousness is this ability to be able to sort of create in our mind like a virtual map of reality, and then to be able to project scenarios into that map. So we can kind of imagine how something would go. And that allows us to do all kinds of really beautiful things, especially with technology or engineering, to be able to visualize problems and test things in a way. So I think, one of the things that Ibogaine does is it like there was a really cool study looking at like before some of the more recent brain imaging stuff. There was one that looked in rats, and Ibogaine was had this effect on the retrosplenial cortex, which was supposedly um, a part of the brain that's involved in creating these virtual maps and mapping out the world around us. And what it was showing was that Ibogaine was disrupting this ability to be able to map the world. And so, um, I wonder if it, in some ways, is sort of breaking down the sort of frontal decision-making, problem-solving mechanism that we have in front of us and allowing us to sort of access these deeper problem-solving circuits in the brain. And I think I don't know if it's like that obvious why this is a useful conversation to have, but I think that a lot of the times, the way that psychiatry or psychology wants us to approach problems is like through something like cognitive behavioral therapy or something, where we are sort of, sorry, we are sort of like mapping out a problem over and over again with the, um, I don't know, very like prefrontal decision-making process.
I just muted somebody.
Okay. Um, so yeah, so I think that this gives us an ability to access something else where we kind of acknowledge at some point that maybe consciousness and this very particular mode of cognition has not been helping us, and that we need to disrupt it a little bit, especially when it gets into a rut, like we're always trying to solve problems the same way. Um, and so it allows us to try to reconfigure some more foundational sort of ways that we're processing information in the subconscious. So
Terence McKenna calls it novelty, that you have to introduce novelty into your life
yes.
for creativity or change to happen. So,
Yeah. So the difference would be like like for example with trauma or whatever. Like a lot of people will say that Ibogaine brings up like a review of childhood or something. But I think that's like maybe sometimes, but it's like usually weirder than that. Or like if it does bring up childhood memories, there's a lot of other things going on at the same time that are even weirder. And so I think we're still trying to wrestle with like if you just go back to the raw data of like what people actually describe, if you ask them, it is weirder than just the content. So it's not just about reviewing traumatic moments or thinking through a very specific problem. I don't think that's what it does. I think it brings us into contact with a very different mode of cognition that allows us to solve problems in a completely different way. And it almost doesn't matter what the hell kind of content we're dealing with in the moment, but it's that process.
So it shifts your perspective, like almost gives you a bird's eye view or a God's eye view, or you could call it that, a different perspective. And also some element of detachment. You talk about that and the witness of
Hmm.
that. That's very powerful because you're so attached. I mean, in our default mode network, they call it. I used to call it the ego, whatever you call it. We're so caught up in results sometimes, goal oriented. And so I guess that detachment helps you to see something else. Um, and from your book, you're talking about how it has a long Ibogaine has a long arc, and I thought that was really interesting because you compared other psychedelics with Ibogaine, and the big difference being that you're lucid and grounded at the same time. Can you talk a little bit about the effect of Ibogaine as you've seen it, and how it what the difference is from other psychedelics? Because many people have experienced other psychedelics, but Ibogaine is so remarkably different.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that I try to describe it to people when they're going in, especially, it almost doesn't matter like if people have taken a psychedelic before or not. And a lot of people who are coming to Ambio have not. But I think still the way that they imagine what a psychedelic experience is like, they get a lot of information from like art or movies, and I think it's still quite different from what people expect. Like that's the common thing. Like if it's what you expect, it is very rarely people come out and say that's exactly what I thought it was going to be. I don't know if that's ever happened. So I don't know. The way that I sort of remember it is when you're taking like mushrooms or LSD or something, it kind of feels like the environment around you is like lit up and saturated with life and breath and significance. And it's really like imminent. And then internally, too, the things that you're feeling and thinking about are also saturated with meaning and importance. And then, you know, everything is sort of the boundary that we normally experience between things is not quite where we knew it was. And so that sort of challenges our sense of our identity. And I think with Ibogaine, sometimes I say it's almost like the opposites, because people are not really drawn to exploring the world around them. Like sometimes there's things that can happen if you do like open your eyes, or like in Bhuti initiation, sometimes they don't let you lay down and they want you to see some stuff. But the impulse is usually to like close your eyes and turn inward, um and then the things that we see and that we feel, they sort of feel like they're being presented to us. Like we do retain a strong sense of familiarity, even to the point where like you can sort of easily interrupt it by just like putting your hand up and having a conversation with the nurse, which is so different than like when you're peaking on on mushrooms or peyote or something like that. You're in it. Like you're on the roller coaster, you know. So, I mean, Ibogaine, it's still gives you a lot to contend with, but I think that that sense of grounding in your own identity is interesting. And it's like you said, it sort of places that part of us into a more passive role, where normally it's the one that's like the go-getter and it's got to go and do all this stuff and achieve things and put meat on the table or whatever. And then all of a sudden now we're in a more passive stance, and there's some deeper part of us that's processing and doing the work that we're engaging with in a different way.
Or some
Hmm.
deeper truth
Yeah.
coming up. Like I my father died and I didn't get to see him, and I was able to get over his not being able to see him in an ayahuasca journey where the deeper truth that came up was that we are eternally connected, and that was what allowed me to heal the temporal truth of not, so that's sometimes it'll bring forward things like that that are such unexpected like sources of healing for a person going through a journey like that.
Yeah, that's really beautiful.
Um, I wanted to ask you about a couple of things you mentioned in your book. Now, I think everyone should read this book. It's really, really well written, really goes over a lot of very important things and gives you such a comprehensive history of Ibogaine as and the characters who've been instrumental in it up to now. Um, but you talk about mirror states, and I would love to hear how you've integrated that mirror reflective process into your treatments at Ambio, or
Yeah.
if you've been able to,
Oh, yeah, we do for sure. So the mirror was something that I had to sit in front of when I went for my first initiation with Iboga in Gabon. And it was at the beginning of the experience, sat up in kind of a uncomfortable position, but like while eating all of the Iboga at the beginning, there was a mirror set up in front of us. And I don't know, I always thought that was kind of a striking image to see, especially I think in contrast because I'd done a lot of psychedelics in the past and even just like wandering into the bathroom or like catching a glimpse of something in like a reflective surface and well especially I think like in the full light of the bathroom mirror it would be like the most sort of shocking to like look at yourself for a moment. um so and I think being in that very passive state, that like witness observer stance, that doesn't have the same shocking intensity as it is with Ibogaine. But I did find that like the mirror sort of almost puts you in this position of like you're the observer and you're being presented with something else that you're in dialogue with at the beginning. It sort of leads you into that mode where, now I'm have a focal point to start to discuss with. It sort of becomes like that prayer. Now, this is where I'm asking my questions and remembering why I'm here, sort of plants you into that moment very strongly.
it's like the
So,
metaphor of self-reflection, just
yeah.
literally living it out, sort of.
Yeah, so that was where I first sort of encountered it. So I was really curious about the mirror, I think, because especially after the first initiation, um, at the time I was really involved with Gita. And so when I went to Gabon, they really wanted me to have a big experience so that I could get the memo. And so I took a lot of iboga. So I remember the mirror and the stuff at the beginning, and the rest of it, I was like, I was in another world. Um, yeah, I didn't remember the ceremony. I remember what was going on for me, but the ceremony was like outside. So that was the one biggest thing that I remember during the trip itself, other than the harp and the music. Um, so yeah, so it left an impression on me. But then the other thing that happened was somebody gave me a little gift of you were talking about this like trefoil knot in Gabon. It was like a little coin that was dried grass woven into like three interlocking circles. And so that came up later when I was reading the work of Jacques Lacan, who is a French psychotherapist or a psychoanalyst. And I'm surprised now, like he's such a powerful writer, but like in English, he doesn't really get discussed that often. But in Spanish and in French, a lot more people talk about Lacan still. And I think partly maybe it's because just like the United States tried to transcend psychoanalysis. Yeah, maybe if you go to Europe, it's a lot more part of the conversation still. But but yeah, so Lacan was not familiar to me until I read him in school. And then this a very similar shape with the trefoil kind of design came up again and was sort of central to describing Lacan's theory. So But Lacan talks about like one of his he was a Freudian psychoanalyst. So if anybody knows about Freud, Freud talked about these like developmental stages. Um, uh, I can't remember the term for them. Anyways, like the oral, anal, phallic phases that we go through at different stages of our life, from like infancy all the way to adulthood. And so interruptions at a specific stage can sort of, for him, have a specific kind of impact on the development of our psyche, and that's what we analyze. For Lacan, he really focused in on something that he called the mirror phase. So, sort of like overlaid on Freud's stuff, but the mirror phase was like between 6 months old and a year and a half. I just had a little baby girl go through this. It was really interesting, like thinking about it the whole time and watching her go through it. But essentially, like before we go through the mirror phase, we don't have a really strong sense of the boundary between us and the world. We're sort of just in this soup of sensation. And so, like discomfort kind of emerges, and then we cry out, and then something happens that helps to calm the sensation by crying out, right? And so that, it's our caretakers coming to nurture us or feed us or whatever, but we don't have a really strong understanding that we're crying out for the external help of a specific person. It's just this expression that's happening. But as we go through the mirror phase, he says it's like when we start to be able to recognize ourself in the mirror, and that it's also around the same time that we do start to recognize that there's these other people around us. And, so the mirror phase is like the mirror itself is metaphorical, like we also see our reflection in how other people react to us. And so as we start to go into this phase, it's like we have to learn now how to start to communicate with these other people, because we start to recognize that we're separate from them, and we have to like negotiate to get what we need. And so in the process, we enter into language. And so this is a really important phase for Lacan. And he talks about like there's something that gets lost, which is a connection to the real, or a connection to basically anything that cannot be categorized or symbolized in our life, and that we enter into the symbolic world. And so we really, really need to enter into the symbolic world, because that's what the world is made of, and that's how we learn to identify and relate to everything else around us. But in the process, we lose the connection with the things that don't neatly fit into categorize or categories.
Mm.
So, um, anyways, I thought this was a really interesting sort of metaphor, and sort of gave another layer of interest to me about like the mirror and what it meant in Bwiti, because it is sort of like, the symbolic world sort of becomes like one of these virtual maps that we use to navigate our way
Mm.
through the world. And Ibogaine comes and sort of disrupts that momentarily, and I think can move us in the direction of being in contact with things that are not so easy to categorize.
So how does that apply to somebody like who's a veteran, who's going through Ibogaine for TBI or PTSD? Um,
Sure. So the the trefoil symbol that Lacan talks about, it has these three realms of the psyche. One of them is the real, one of them is the imaginary, one of them is the symbolic. And he says these are three realms are interlocking. That's why the symbol itself is like woven together, and you can't easily take it apart. If you take one ring out, the whole thing falls apart. That's what the symbol of the knot is supposed to imply. And so, but he says in the very center of that, like at the overlap between all of these realms, there's something that he calls jouissance, which um, it just in French it just means enjoyment, but they left it in French jouissance because just saying enjoyment sort of you lose totally the meaning of it, what he's implying there. And so what he's saying is like jouissance is not what Freud talked about. Freud talked about the pleasure principle. He said that the pleasure drives us. And in his terminology, pleasure just meant like the relief or the release of tension, right? And so, that we would pursue things that would cause us a release of tension. Um, Lacan actually says that no, jouissance is actually something that takes us beyond pleasure. It's something that compels us to try to come into contact with the real and whatever that thing is that cannot be categorized.
Mm.
And that as we do that, as we cross the line beyond what's pleasurable, that we actually enter into the realm of like almost where it becomes uncomfortable or painful. And so when we reach that point, we turn back because it's unbearable.
Mm.
Right. So actually any time that like we're so dependent and bound in the symbolic world, like any time the real interjects at all into the world, it can become um, traumatic, actually, because it sort of shatters the symbolic just based because of what it is. So
So
like
you
one.
you say
Mhm.
symbolic, you mean the symbolism of the world that you've constructed or the rationale that you've constructed around your current world
Yeah,
situation?
yeah, it's like so part of how we understand who we are and how we relate to the world. So like the one example that I think Lacan talks about is like maybe women have more of a connection to the real naturally because as you go through the process of childbirth, you are confronted with the real. It's something that cannot be neatly categorized. It's an experience that sort of shatters the symbolic frame of reference. And in the process, I think there's something that's really, it's not like, I don't know if it's the right term, like, because we get confused about this, but like to say it's like a trauma. But I've heard people say something like positive correlates of trauma or
Mm.
positive analogs of trauma, where it's just something that it still like marks you so deeply that it has like a lasting impact on you. And so, in the process of childbirth, especially, the first time that you go through an experience like that, you become a mother, your identity changes, your relationship with the world around you changes in a fundamental way that you can't really turn back from. And so that's an example of what the real emerging back into the world is. So another example that I use in the book is like as we drive down the street in a car, we're sort of aware of like the speedometer and like all those signs on the road and the lines and everything. And like we kind of that helps us to place like where we are in the world around us. But then, you know, heaven forbid, a car accident brings us in contact with the real. It's something so shocking. And I was talking to somebody recently who was describing like even there's situations where people will be witnessing, not even in the car, but like just witnessing a car accident take place. And then when they go to describe what they all saw, they're all telling different stories about it because that's like the real is it's something that cannot be neatly categorized and so it sort of shatters the symbolic world and our ability to sort of capture it in language
Mm.
in a neat way. So anyways, I think what's what is most clear is like Ibogaine definitely takes you into this realm of like beyond pleasure, beyond comforts, and into the point where things can actually be quite uncomfortable, but change begins to appear there in the process of breaking down our sort of symbolic frame of reference about the world. And so, anyways, I thought that was a useful thing to describe because I think most of the time when we think about medicine or we think about psychiatry, what we understand its role is to reduce symptoms, which is much more like what Freud was talking about of the release of tensions. But I think Lacan provides us a better model to think about Ibogaine, where it's actually the transformation comes by going beyond pleasure and coming in contact with the real and allowing us to be transformed by that. And I don't think that fits into the same sort of linear way that we understand medicine. And so, what I was trying to describe in the book, just by grappling with what the experience that Ibogaine brings up is maybe like how it isn't, it's like it's got more edges to it than the square box that it would be nice to fit it into.
Yeah.
And it's not like as
Multidimensional
convenient.
edges.
It's not as convenient as we hope it would
Yeah.
be. But I think in the process we have to like learn about it and wrestle with what it actually is.
So the discomfort, what you're talking about, the discomfort, the threshold that you have to move through, kind of like a birth canal, the difficulty of going through it. Um, it's what disrupts your worldview. And do you correlate that with what people describe as a death and rebirth? Because it's a death of the way you see something and a rebirth of a new way. Is that um, a part of your correlation here?
Yeah, I think all of those are sort of similar metaphors. Like even in Bwiti, they talk about it like a rebirth, and like when you're coming out of Ibogaine, you're in a state of infancy when, we are supposedly more in contact with the real before we sort of have to negotiate how we fit into the symbolic order of the world around us. So it sort of takes us back to that. And in a real sense, in the community too, you're given a new name. There's different expectations that are placed on you now. You're taught a new language. Um, like that's sort of built into the structure of the initiation. And then in the West, where we talk about, it initiates sort of a neurological second childhood and allows us to reimagine you know, our choices or change, our symbolic strategy. I saw an interesting question come up in the chat. And it's like, why can't we find the real in nature? Why do we have to use an intoxicant? I don't understand why braving cardiotoxicity when you could, hike. And yeah, like I think, yeah, of course, yeah, there's other ways that people try to encounter the real. But I think the way that Lacan I was thinking about is probably a bit more like if you're like, you know, cliff jumping with a squirrel suit rather than hiking or something. It's something that like pushes you like so far beyond um and to the point where like your heart's racing and like things are really intense. But I do think that the correlate might be like any time when we do difficult things, like yeah, going and training to run a marathon or like going to the gym even when it sucks, like whatever, like the things where we do have to push ourselves that have value to us. I think that's very similar. And I think that where Ibogaine has come in for people, it's like when that's not part of the habit and the habit reverts to looking like the pursuit of pleasure. Which I mean it in like a literal sense, like even when drug use becomes unpleasurable, it's still the pursuit of like short-term release rather than doing something that is immediately uncomfortable with the promise of transformation in the end. So I think it where it's been the most helpful for people is people who need to reorganize how they relate with yeah, like doing difficult things or challenging themselves to grow and learn and evolve. So, but yeah, I'm not saying like everybody needs to do that because otherwise you're not in touch with reality or something like that. That's not at all the point.
Well, if you look at these medicines, these plant medicines, as not being intoxicants, but being like spiritual medicine or food for the psyche, for the body, mind, spirit, which is what they end up being. And that whole new field of psychedelic medicine is initiating that in our culture right now. Um, Grace, yeah, I think if you reframe the intoxicant part, and look at these as powerful alchemical substances, which is really what they are. Does anybody else have any questions? I think we have 9 minutes left.
Hi, it's Rachel. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, one in and out. Um, when does the book come out? Question one, when does the book come out? September?
Yeah. So it'll be September 8th. So we're still a couple of months away.
I'm really excited that you were able to write all this down. Like really, really excited. Congratulations. All right, question two. It's very self-interested. Um, you were talking about Freudian phases, and I can't remember because it literally it's been 40 years since I read that stuff. So what's after the mirror phase? And also how does uh Dr. Freud's thing about the phallus, how does that flip over into a female situation?
Yeah, I don't oh, the latter one I don't know. I haven't like read or wrestled with Freud as much as like trying to understand Lacan because I it was more interesting for me, just all the reference points that I had with it. So um yeah, so rather than trying to make a point about the phallic phase, that was just a offhand mention. But the mirror phase, so I didn't read Lacan like he was saying, like he was trying to map out the whole journey like through different phases. What I understood it as was like the mirror phase sets us up in a way, and then there's implications of that that affect us through our whole life. And so then it creates this these like three orders in the psyche that he talks about. And there's other sort of elements of his theories that sort of stem from the other like roots back to the mirror phase.
Awesome. Thank you.
And
My
yeah,
battery's gonna go. Sorry, I'm checking out. Thank
sure. Oh, you're muted, Lakshmi.
Could you talk about this idea of space binding versus time binding that you talk about in the book? It's very fascinating.
Sure. Well, that definitely was not mine. That was came from Fernandez. James Fernandez, who wrote a book called Bwiti, an ethnography of the religious imagination in Africa. And in he did this beautiful ethnography in like Fang communities. Um, Spent many, many years there, I think in the 70s. And it was this, it's like a massive tome of a book, really, really interesting work. And then later, I think he came in contact with the Ibogaine community in the West. And so he wrote some interesting papers that sort of talking about these correlates between the way that it's used and understood in Gabonese worldview and then in the West. And so I think that the he picked up on this theory about time and space binding as a way to kind of bridge these two very different contexts. And so when I read it, I thought it sounded really cool, but then I didn't really understand. So I read back into like the history of those terms and what they meant. And so it sort of went back to this writer named Alfred Korbisky, who defined those terms. And what he was saying was like space binding is like when generation after generation, things have the same starting point as before. So like if you just talk about like plant genetics, things change very slowly because they're basically have the same starting point. Like the seed has the same hologram that grows into the flower and then it drops another seed and it has essentially the same starting point as the next one and the next one and the next one. So change happens it happens, but happens extremely slowly. And what that kind of space binding allows for something to do is to like move through space. Like, the same seed then can now copy itself and like scatter through the whole field. Um, Time binding, he was saying, was it's actually where from like one generation to the next, there's an accumulation of knowledge that gets carried forward and carried forward and carried forward. So science is a good example. He says this is sort of fundamental to like the human experience, but science is a good example where, somebody can spend their entire life working on something like Einstein, go on all these things and then come out with like a neat little equation. And then all of a sudden everybody can use that equation and start having new thoughts. And it sort of builds and builds and builds and builds and takes us down a new path. So it allows for sort of evolution or like complexity of information. And so that allows not just like where a plant like moves throughout the field, but allows us to sort of navigate through time, right? Because we're able to project into the future.
Hmm.
So he was saying that Ibogaine clarified this very human experience for people. And like, I don't know, one example is just in addiction. I think when you get into something that is such a patterned way of life of just like using or looking for a fix and using and using and using, it begins to look and feel a lot more like a space-bound existence. And it's what drives a drug through the world, like to be transported everywhere. Um, and then one of the things that's actually lost in an addiction is the ability to be able to get negative feedback about something. Like we start to see like consequences emerge, and it's like all of a sudden we're not responding to that information and just going straight back into the cycle, this sort of space-bound cycle we're stuck in. And what Ibogaine seems to be able to do is give people back this ability, not just to be able to have a choice, but to be able to build on the information that came before and sort of start to learn again and reconstruct a path through time like that. So I think that's what he was describing, and that had a really powerful correlate for um, Bantu communities in Gabon who are being displaced by colonialism and having to reestablish a sense of identity, and in the West, and people who had been displaced from society because of drug use and having to reestablish, like I think, you could maybe say that's what's being recovered is that ability to be able to learn and to build upon information and move forward. So I think that's the best answer I can give off the top of my head. Veronica.
Well, that's a great answer.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Bring back passion and purpose and jouissance, as you say,
Yes.
into life, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're at the 12:30. Did you have a hard stop?
I'd love to hear from Veronica.
Thank you.
Ah, Veronica. Nice.
Thank you. Well, Jonathan, wow,
Hey.
what a wonderful morning. In you after all the years here in Mexico to and in Gabon and South Africa and like that. But congratulations for Ambio, congratulations for your book. And wow, great to see you again. And how we can get your book?
It's so good to see you too. I don't know if everybody knows, but you were right beside me on the floor in Gabon when I was getting initiated the first time, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it'll be out in September and you can pre-order it and we'll get it sent to you. Although I don't 100% know how it'll work in Mexico. I think I can work it out so that we could get one down to you.
All
And
right.
undecided by the publisher yet, but I don't know if they're going to make a Spanish version. I really hope they do because I think there's a lot of um, people who are like stakeholders in that story who would read in Spanish or in French, but I hope they do translate them.
Yeah, it will be very good. Very good.
Yeah. But yeah, I'll make sure that you get one.
Yeah. And well, in French could be very good because I'm going to have two French people. I had one last year, and in July it's coming two French guys.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, it's so good to see
Yeah. Woo. Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Lakshmi. Thank you.
You're welcome. Jonathan, can you just quickly say how people can reach Ambio, or can you just how people can reach you
Yeah.
or Ambio?
Yeah, sure. So if anybody's interested in Ambio, you can look us up at ambio.life. And if you're interested in the book and pre-ordering the book, you can get it anywhere like on Amazon or whatever, or you can find it on my site. It's jonathandickinson.ca.
I just wanted to mention I left the link in the chat for your book, if anybody's interested.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. It's been really wonderful talking to you, and I look forward to the book coming out, and I hope a lot of people read it.
Great. Well, thank you
And
so much. I appreciate it. That was nice.
yeah, you're welcome.
All right. It was good to see you all. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.